Amazon does something bad, we can't just all boycott Amazon. We don't have that freedom. We're all part of this interconnected system. And I mean, we can do better than this. We're almost at the, technologically at least, at the level of post-scarcity, as I will show with some of my things. Let's see. And there's the wealthy in the world generally, they have a lot of responsibilities and also incentives to not really help either, even though in principle they have economic independence and they can they have sometimes the freedom to do something, like in the case of Elon, perhaps. So various political systems, they all corrode over time, I would say. Communism is often seen as a power vacuum, and then it requires a strong central government to enforce, and then a bad actor can come in and take control of that. Capitalism, if you have pure free market capitalism, eventually what you get, some people do better than others. They use what they learn and the capital they have to reinforce their position, and you just eventually get a corporate oligarchy, a system of monopolies or other structures. So we don't really have a stable social structure over really long periods of time. And also, legally speaking, we have like no garbage collector. That's a programming term. In programming languages, there's this concept of if you have, and I'll get into more technical stuff soon, but yeah, so in programming, a garbage collector basically, it takes like data that's not being used anymore and frees up the space in the computer. And most governments that exist, most social structures indeed, they have systems that build up complexity, but they never have a way of deciding when a component of that complexity is no longer required or needs to be revised. I mean, sometimes they have a little bit of that structure, but it's like Elon Musk said, it's generally, if you don't have a way of getting rid of old laws that are not necessary anymore, your system will grow more and more complicated until like no one can get anything done by red tape. So what we have constructed as a global society is a paperclip maximizer for GDP. And that's not good because there's a whole bunch of other things we might want, like the environment, our own well-being, et cetera. And yeah, I mean, if we don't have our own personal freedom and economic opportunities, then the system is very brittle. It's very top heavy. And if structures at the top fall apart, then we're kind of out of luck. So what solutions do we have? Well, so some people are thinking like transhumanism. If we can change the nature of people, then we can make a capitalist system or a communist system or whatever else that is stable. That's going to take a long time, although there are things we could potentially do, CRISPR, Neuralink, but whatever. A lot of this is controversial, understandably. And I'm sure that there'll be a lot of feedback and conversation in the comments. Constitutional conventions, I mean, that's another thing that we should consider. But anyway, getting down to what we can do technologically outside of all of those social structures that move slowly and change slowly. We should cut out all the noise, focus on actionable intel, test real devices. This has been something that's been absorbed by the APEC crowd very well. We shouldn't generally trust concentrated power structures. Like in the US, generally conservatives trust corporations and not the government. And on the other side, on the liberal side, they trust government but not corporations. Really, you can't technically trust either. I mean, in some sense. Anyway, but we can get our economic independence by technological means, and it's not really new. Like, it's as old as history itself. Hunter-gatherers were technically independent. The Amish are independent with a lower standard of living. The monasteries after the fall of Rome had to be self-sufficient or they wouldn't have survived. So it's possible to be self-sufficient without advanced technology. However, if we want a modern standard of living, we need to work a little bit harder. So there's a whole bunch of areas where people can contribute, even if they don't necessarily know any of these propulsion technologies. So making fully general manufacturing capability, like something that someone could have on a tabletop that can print an iPhone. That's a very complicated problem, but there's a lot of people working on it, as I'll mention a little bit about. Recycling and raw materials processing, that's key. I mean, ultimately the only limited resource is energy, and that's maybe even not true. We'll see. Yeah, and then food, energy production, mobility. If we have all those basics and we can like print an iPhone and print all the modern things that we might need, we're in pretty good shape. We don't have to participate in a greater economy if we don't want to. And we can walk away from any power structure which is becoming hostile. So another important part of this, I think that it was mentioned in previous APEX and maybe not understood by some of the older people in the crowd, is the open source strategy is very important to what we want to do, especially in the US. So where did I mention the patents? Oh, I'm missing a little bit. Well, anyways, yeah, so in the US, it's first to file. It's not a common thing. A lot of other nations just have first to like post information about or whatever you call it. But the other problem on top of that, though, is that, oh, maybe it was one of these. Oh yeah, the patent dilemma, here it was. So anyway, yeah, you need a provisional patent to prevent others from patenting within the first year. But then if it's something that the military wants not to get out, they can just take it. And if you don't get that provisional patent, someone else who wants that thing can get it, but then the military will just still take it. So that's tricky. And what we do to get around that is this open source stuff. So, I mean, if you're not making any money off of it, they can't really tell you no. If it's fully open source, it's not ideal, but like, I mean, you can't make money off of it while the patent exists. But it's better than the alternative because now the information's out there and people are benefiting from it instead of getting locked up in some like classified thing and never being released. So that's something. And then there's just some useful tips and tricks. SEL4, CubesOS, all these things are, I mean, you can go over them in more detail. Influence mapping is an important tool for understanding the modern world, generally speaking. And there's a few sources of information done in Bradsheet, SEC, Edgar. These things are still untainted by like fake news and other things because there is a legal responsibility with teeth for corporations not to lie in these sorts of information references. Anyways, I'll get into some of the things that we can actually do. So nested greenhouses, and in space, bonsai might be actually a very useful thing. Growing things smaller than they grow in nature may be useful for actually getting like large trees and things growing in space. If you're talking about making some food growing apparatus, because that's going to be at a premium because you're limited by the amount of surface area of your habitat in space. Anyways, ecosystem engineering, we're going to have to get good at that, whether or not we get off this planet. Just, I mean, a quick calculation, and this is extremely conservative. Our ecosystem is worth like 1,000 trillion, even just in pharmaceutical value. So like, that's not accounting all the other positive externalities, like the air that we breathe. So any other species out there in the universe that are looking at us right now, they must think we're insane to destroy literally the most valuable thing that we have that doesn't exist anywhere else in the universe. Just because of combinatorics, to find an equivalent species to something on Earth out there in the universe, you're gonna have to, like, just by probability, you're going to have to travel some enormous, ungodly, impractical distance, even for whoever is out there now, probably. So, I mean, there's tremendous value in there. And there's a lot of places that have done some interesting work, like Las Gaviotas, Colombia. It's a little town. Oops. Why did it jump? Okay, cool. So yeah, Las Gaviotas, Colombia, they've done a lot of cool work with producing a society which is in harmony with nature. It took them a while to figure it out, but then eventually they found a way to use regenerative agriculture to reclaim savanna into rainforest and produce a profit in the process. There's ways to do this. That we need to figure this out as a species. Anyways, Permian mass extinction, I was going to mention this. Climate change, another, I mean, some people consider this controversial, but could be even worse than any of the predictions, because, I mean, we should be looking also at deep ocean CO2 concentrations. Once that gets toxic, things in the deep ocean will all just die, and that gigantic biomass will release hydrogen sulfide and probably start killing off a lot of things on land at that point. So we don't want to be in that situation, but it looks like we're barreling right towards it, and not many people talk about that. But I mean, maybe people think other things will happen first. But and I mean, for those who like are skeptical about all the climate change stuff, just ask any oyster farmer, not even necessarily like a climate scientist or whatever. Just ask an oyster farmer about ocean acidification. They have to literally, when they're growing their new oysters each year, they have to like fix the pH of the ocean water with bases to reduce the acidity of the CO2 in the water before they can actually grow oysters. So there's other ways to find out this information if you think that someone's co-opting the other information, and then you can figure out who's really telling the truth. Anyway, electroculture is interesting. I think that guy, the old scientist on YouTube, was looking at this. Oop, it jumped again. And that's using electrostatic and electromagnetic fields to affect plant growth. Interesting idea. I think that it's mostly because of the modulation of enzymes and other protein activity in cells, because you can affect that with electrostatic and RF fields if they're strong enough. You can actually modulate, you can modify protein conformation, because the conformational change energies are at, they happen at similar electron volt levels to like radio frequency. So that's something that people should be playing around with a lot more in terms of like cures for things, diseases, etc. You could do a lot of interesting things there potentially. And I don't think people have considered that possibility very much yet. So play around with RF, see if you can like figure out what frequencies different proteins resonate at, if you can get protein samples. That might be interesting. And then there's something else, incinerating toilets. This is a strange thing perhaps, but really if you think about it, the system we have now is even stranger. We take our like sewage and we run it through pipes to a centralized center to treat it. And those pipes are just supposed to last indefinitely. They're infinitely strong, never corrode, whatever. That's not sane. That eventually that system will break. So if we can have waste treatment on site at every like house and home for a reasonable amount of energy, and there's interesting things. There was a technology I saw in Vancouver. So that's instantaneous propagation in a sense, but only because you can think of the vacuum as at resonance, quote unquote, with zero refractive index for electrostatic fields. It's a limit case which does not apply to material to wavelengths to frequencies greater than zero. I mean, in a zero index metamaterial, now you can get a non-zero frequency that has apparently zero refractive index within the metamaterial. Similar idea. So what that gets us is something interesting we can play